April 27, 2011. A date that should have been ordinary. A normal spring Wednesday across the American South. Families planning dinner, kids finishing homework, the usual rhythms of life playing out under afternoon skies. But nothing. Nothing about that day would be ordinary. By the time the sun set that evening, more than 200 tornadoes had touched down across multiple states. 4 of them. 4 of the most violent storms nature can create. Rated EF5, the highest category possible, with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Entire neighborhoods erased from existence. 238 people dead in Alabama alone. 316 fatalities across the region. The largest, deadliest, most catastrophic tornado outbreak ever recorded in United States history. This is the story of how the sky became a weapon, and how thousands of lives changed forever in a single afternoon. This is the story of the 2011 Super Outbreak. So, what created this perfect storm? What made April 27 different from every other severe weather day? The answer lies in something meteorologists call a perfect convergence. In late April 2011, a massive upper-level trough, a dip in the jet stream, was pushing east from the Rockies toward the plains. Now, troughs like this happen all the time during spring. But this one was different. This one was deep, carving through the atmosphere like a knife, and it was moving into an environment that was already primed. Warm, moist air was streaming north from the Gulf of Mexico, pumping incredible amounts of energy into the atmosphere. We're talking about dew points in the upper 60s, even low 70s in some areas. For context, that's the kind of moisture you'd expect in the peak of summer, not April. This moisture, this fuel, was colliding with a powerful jet stream aloft, winds screaming at 80, 90, even 100 knots at mid-levels of the atmosphere. And then there was the shear. Wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was off the charts. When you combine extreme moisture, massive instability, and that kind of shear, you get supercells. Not just ordinary thunderstorms, but rotating supercells, the kind that birth the most violent tornadoes on Earth. By April 24th, meteorologists were already seeing the signs. The Storm Prediction Center, the nerve center for severe weather forecasting in the United States, began issuing warnings, a slight risk at first, then moderate, and then, as the data came in, as the models aligned, the threat became undeniable. This wasn't going to be just another outbreak. This was going to be historic. But let's rewind for a moment, because the story of April 27 actually begins 2 days earlier, on April 25th, 2011. It was a Monday evening in Valonia, Arkansas, a small town of about 3,000 people. Families were sitting down to dinner, the day winding down. The Storm Prediction Center had issued a moderate risk for severe weather across parts of the South, including Arkansas. But moderate risks happen fairly often in spring. Most people had lived through them before. Around 7:15 p.m., Central Daylight Time, the National Weather Service in Little Rock issued a tornado warning for Faulkner County. Radar was showing rotation, a classic hook echo on the screen. Emergency sirens began to wail across Valonia, and then it arrived. A massive wedge-shaped tornado, nearly a quarter-mile wide, descended from the darkened clouds and plowed directly through the heart of Valonia. The sound, survivors would later say, was like a freight train mixed with a roar, a deep, guttural rumble that shook the ground. Homes were ripped apart. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped like toothpicks. Debris, clothing, insulation, pieces of people's lives was hurled thousands of feet into the air. The tornado was rated EF2, with winds around 125 miles per hour. 4 people died that evening. Dozens more were injured. The town was devastated. But here's the thing. This tornado, as terrible as it was just the beginning. April 25th produced dozens of tornadoes across the South. Communities in Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama were hit. Power lines came down, trees blocked roads, homes were damaged. It was a significant outbreak by any measure, and yet, what was coming on April 27th would make this day look like a warm-up. Meteorologists knew it. By the evening of April 25th, The Storm Prediction Center was already looking ahead, analyzing the data for Wednesday, and what they saw was terrifying. Now, before we go further, I want to explain something because understanding the scale of what happened requires understanding what we mean by a super outbreak. The term isn't used lightly. An outbreak in meteorological terms generally means 6 or more tornadoes produced by the same weather system. A super outbreak? That's reserved for the truly extraordinary events, the ones that produce dozens of significant tornadoes, multiple violent storms, and widespread devastation. The benchmark for decades was the 1974 Super Outbreak, which occurred on April 3rd and 4th. That event produced 148 confirmed tornadoes across 13 states, killed 330 people, and left a scar on American memory. For 37 years, it stood as the gold standard, the worst tornado outbreak in modern history. April 2011 would shatter that record completely. Between April 25th and April 28th, the outbreak would spawn 368 confirmed tornadoes across 21 states. Think about that for a second. 368 tornadoes. That's more than double the 1974 outbreak. And April 27, that single day, would account for 224 of those tornadoes. 224 tornadoes in one day. To put that in perspective, the average tornado season in the entire United States sees about 1,000 tornadoes per year. On April 27 alone, nearly a quarter of an annual average fell in just 24 hours. It was an assault from the sky, relentless, merciless, unprecedented. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to April 26th, the day before the worst day. By Tuesday, April 26th, the Storm Prediction Center had issued a high risk for severe weather, the highest level of alert, across parts of Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas. High risks are rare. They're only issued a handful of times per year, and they mean one thing: significant, widespread, violent tornadoes are expected. And the storms delivered. Tornado after tornado touched down that afternoon and evening. Some were weak, brief EF0s and EF1s that damaged trees and roofs. But others were monsters. Long-track supercells carved paths for dozens of miles, obliterating everything in their way. Homes, businesses, farms, gone. 55 tornadoes were confirmed on April 26th alone. Multiple people were killed. Communities across the South were reeling, trying to assess the damage, trying to pick up the pieces. But the meteorologists weren't celebrating. They weren't breathing sighs of relief. Because as bad as April 26th had been, April 27th was going to be worse. Far worse. That evening, the Storm Prediction Center issued their outlook for the next day. And it was chilling. A high risk was issued across a massive area, stretching from Mississippi and Alabama up into Tennessee. The language in the forecast discussion was stark, almost apocalyptic. Widespread damaging winds and tornadoes are expected, the forecasters wrote. Several tornadoes are expected to be strong to violent. Violent. EF4 and EF5 tornadoes. The kind that level everything, the kind that kill. And then came the kicker. This will be a particularly dangerous situation. Those words, particularly dangerous situation, are not used often. They're reserved for days when forecasters believe the threat is so extreme, so life-threatening, that the public needs every possible warning. It's the meteorological equivalent of a red alert. Local news stations across the South began covering the threat that evening. Meteorologists, many of them visibly concerned, urged viewers to have a plan, to know where their safe space was, to charge their phones, to keep their weather radios handy. There was a palpable sense of dread building. And then, the sun rose on April 27th, 2011. The morning started quietly, almost deceptively so. If you were in Birmingham, Alabama, or Tuscaloosa, or Huntsville, you might have woken up to partly cloudy skies, maybe a light breeze. It felt like spring, the kind of morning where you'd grab your coffee, step outside, and enjoy the fresh air. But the atmosphere was loaded. By mid-morning, the warm front had pushed north, and moisture was surging. Temperatures were climbing into the 70s and 80s, dew points into the upper 60s. The air felt thick, heavy, unstable. On radar, forecasters could see the ingredients coming together in real time. The jet stream was screaming overhead, wind shear values were extreme, and the cap, the lid of warm air that usually suppresses thunderstorm development until afternoon, was weakening. And then, shortly before dawn, the first round of storms arrived. A squall line, a line of thunderstorms with embedded supercells, raced east across Mississippi and into Alabama and Tennessee. These weren't just rain showers. These were tornadic storms. Tornado warnings were issued rapid fire as the line pushed through. Communities barely had time to react. One tornado after another touched down, many of them at night or in the pre-dawn darkness. The most dangerous time for tornadoes because people can't see them coming. Homes were destroyed, trees toppled, power lines snapped, and critically, that early morning round of storms knocked out power across huge swaths of the region. No power meant no weather radios for many, no television, no way to receive warnings except through battery-powered devices or smartphones, and even those were limited if cell towers went down. Communities that had been slammed in the morning were now sitting in the dark, assessing damage, unaware that the worst was still ahead. Because after the morning squall line passed, the atmosphere began to destabilize again. The sun broke through the clouds in places, heating the surface, adding more fuel, and by early afternoon, the Storm Prediction Center issued an updated outlook. The high-risk area was expanded. The language became even more dire. A major and life-threatening tornado outbreak is expected, the discussion read. Multiple violent tornadoes are likely. And then, around 2:30 p.m., Central Daylight Time, the first EF5 tornado of the day touched down. Philadelphia, Mississippi, a small town of about 7,000 people nestled in the east-central part of the state. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where Friday night football is a big deal, where life moves at a slower, quieter pace. At 2:30 that afternoon, a supercell thunderstorm that had been organizing for the past hour dropped a tornado just southwest of town. Within seconds, it became clear this wasn't an ordinary tornado. The funnel grew rapidly, darkening, widening, becoming a monstrous, churning column of wind and debris. By the time it reached Philadelphia, it was nearly a mile wide, an enormous wedge that covered the entire visible horizon. Winds inside the tornado reached 205 miles per hour. Trees weren't just uprooted, they were debarked, stripped completely of their bark and branches, reduced to shredded stumps. Homes were obliterated, not just blown apart but removed from their foundations. The concrete slabs scoured clean. Cars were thrown hundreds of yards, mangled beyond recognition. The tornado stayed on the ground for more than 40 minutes, carving a path nearly 28 miles long. 3 people lost their lives. Dozens more were injured. The damage, the devastation, was almost incomprehensible. And this was just the first of 5 of the day. Now, let me pause here for a second, because I want you to understand what an EF5 tornado really means. The enhanced Fujita scale, which meteorologists use to rate tornado intensity, goes from EF0 to EF5. An EF0 might knock down some tree branches, peel shingles off a roof. An EF2, like the one that hit Valonia on April 25th, can destroy homes and kill people if they're caught in the open. An EF4 can level well-built houses, throw vehicles, cause catastrophic damage. But an EF5 is almost beyond description. Winds in an EF5 exceed 200 miles per hour. To put that in context, a Category 5 hurricane has sustained winds of 157 miles per hour or higher. An EF5 tornado is stronger than the most violent hurricanes, and it concentrates all that power into a relatively small area, sometimes less than a mile wide, but with focused, rotating winds that create forces unlike anything else in nature. EF5. Damage is total, complete. Homes are not just destroyed, they're erased, reduced to splinters, and scattered across the landscape. Vehicles weighing thousands of pounds are thrown like toys. Asphalt is ripped from roads. Trees are debarked and snapped at ground level. Survivors talk about the sound, the roar, but also the silence afterward. The eerie quiet where once there was a neighborhood. EF5 tornadoes are incredibly rare. On average, the United States sees fewer than one per year. Some years, there are none. In the entire period from 2000 to 2010, only 8 EF5 tornadoes were recorded in the U.S. On April 27, 2011, there would be four EF5 tornadoes in one afternoon. Let that sink in. After the Philadelphia tornado lifted, meteorologists barely had time to process what they'd just witnessed before the next supercell began to intensify. This one was tracking northeast through Mississippi, heading toward the Alabama state line. Radar showed a massive hook echo, rotation that was violent and persistent. Tornado warnings were issued for county after county as the storm barreled forward, and behind it, more supercells were forming. The atmosphere was absolutely exploding with convection. On radar, the images looked apocalyptic, like something out of a disaster film. Supercell after supercell, each one with rotation, each one capable of producing tornadoes. By mid-afternoon, the National Weather Service offices in Birmingham, Huntsville, and Memphis were issuing tornado warnings almost continuously. The alerts were coming so fast that meteorologists didn't have time to update one warning before another was needed. Some offices resorted to issuing tornado emergencies, a special rare alert used only when a large, violent tornado is bearing down on a populated area and catastrophic damage is imminent. And then, around 5:10 p.m., Central Daylight Time, the tornado that would become the face of the outbreak touched down. Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Tuscaloosa is a city of about 95,000 people, home to the University of Alabama. It's a vibrant, growing city with a rich history, a strong sense of community, and on that April afternoon, it was directly in the path of one of the most violent tornadoes ever recorded. The supercell that produced the Tuscaloosa tornado had been tracked for over an hour. Meteorologists knew it was coming. Warnings had been issued. Sirens were blaring. People were taking shelter. But nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. At 5:10 p.m., the tornado touched down just southwest of Tuscaloosa. Within minutes, it grew into a massive, multi-vortex wedge, nearly 1.5 miles wide. Multiple smaller vortices, sub-tornadoes, rotated around the main circulation, each one capable of EF4 or EF5 damage on its own. The tornado plowed directly through the heart of Tuscaloosa, a densely populated area with homes, businesses, apartment complexes. The destruction was apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Not damaged, vanished. Homes were reduced to bare foundations, the debris scattered for miles. Vehicles were thrown and mangled. Trees, massive old oaks and pines, were snapped and debarked. The tornado was so powerful that it changed the landscape, leaving a visible scar on the earth that you could see from space. And it didn't stop in Tuscaloosa. The tornado continued northeast, crossing into Birmingham, Alabama's largest city. It tore through suburbs, industrial areas, more neighborhoods. The path length was 80 miles. 80 miles of uninterrupted devastation. 64 people died along that path. 64 lives gone in an afternoon. Hundreds more were injured, some critically. Families were torn apart, communities were shattered, and even as that tornado was still on the ground, more were forming. The Tuscaloosa-Birmingham tornado would be rated EF4, with maximum winds estimated at 190 miles per hour, just 10 miles per hour short of EF5 status. But the outbreak wasn't done, not even close. To the west, another supercell was organizing over northwest Alabama, near the Mississippi state line. This storm had a history, a track record of producing violent tornadoes. And around late afternoon, it dropped what would become one of the most destructive tornadoes of the entire outbreak, the Hackleberg-Phil Campbell tornado. This tornado touched down near the town of Hackleberg, Alabama, a small community of about 1,500 people. From the moment it formed, it was violent. The funnel was dark, massive, churning with debris. It moved northeast, directly through Hackleberg, obliterating everything in its path. Then it continued, through Phil Campbell, another small town, through rural areas, farms, forests. The tornado stayed on the ground for 91 miles. 91 miles of EF5 violence, with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Trees were completely debarked and shredded. Homes were removed from their foundations, the concrete scoured and pitted by the force of the debris. Vehicles were thrown impossible distances. The damage was so extreme, so total, that in some areas it was difficult for survivors and first responders to even navigate, because nothing looked the same. 72 people died along the path of the Hackleberg-Phil Campbell tornado. 72, and still, the day wasn't over. As the Hackleberg-Phil Campbell tornado was carving its 91-mile path of destruction across northwest Alabama, meteorologists at the National Weather Service office in Huntsville were watching their radar screens with growing horror. Because another supercell, another rotating monster, was developing to the east. And this one was headed for some of the most vulnerable communities in the region. The storm was tracking northeast through rural northeast Alabama, an area of small towns, rolling hills, and dense forests. Communities like Rainsville, Sylvania, Ider, places where people lived close to the land, where tornado shelters were rare, where many homes were mobile homes or older structures that couldn't withstand extreme winds. And at approximately 6:19 p.m., Central Daylight Time, the fourth and final EF5 tornado of April 27 touched down. The Rainsville tornado was a monster. From the moment it formed, witnesses described it as a massive, wedge-shaped wall of destruction, so wide that you couldn't see where it ended. The sky turned a sickly greenish black. The air pressure dropped so suddenly that people's ears popped, and then the roar began. The tornado moved through Rainsville, a town of about 5,000 people, with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Homes weren't just destroyed, they were pulverized, reduced to fragments scattered across what used to be yards and streets. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. Trees that had stood for a century were ripped from the ground, root systems and all, and thrown like spears. Vehicles were found wrapped around what remained of telephone poles, or embedded in the ground. The tornado stayed on the ground for over 36 miles, maintaining EF5 intensity for much of that distance. It was so violent, so powerful, that it created its own weather patterns. Witnesses reported seeing lightning inside the funnel itself, electrical discharges from the friction and chaos within the storm. 25 people died along the Rainsville tornado's path. 25 lives snuffed out in minutes. Families huddled in bathtubs, in closets, in interior rooms, and some of them never made it out. The tornado was simply too powerful, too violent, too all-consuming. And here's what made it even more heartbreaking. Many of the people in Rainsville's path had no power. Remember, the morning storms had knocked out electricity across huge portions of Alabama. No power meant no TV weather coverage. No weather radios for many families. No way to know that this massive violent tornado was bearing down on them until they heard the roar or saw the darkness approaching. Some people had only seconds of warning, seconds to make life or death decisions. But even as the Rainsville tornado was tearing through northeast Alabama, the outbreak wasn't finished. Not yet. To the south, more supercells were developing. To the east, storms were crossing into Georgia and Tennessee. Tornado warnings continued to be issued throughout the evening, one after another, a relentless barrage that seemed like it would never end. By early evening, parts of Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia looked like war zones. Entire towns had been wiped off the map. Major highways were blocked by debris, trees, power lines, pieces of homes scattered across the asphalt. Emergency services were overwhelmed. 911 call centers were flooded with desperate pleas for help, and in many cases, there simply weren't enough first responders to reach everyone. Some people were trapped in the rubble of their homes, injured, calling out for help that wouldn't arrive for hours. Others wandered through what used to be their neighborhoods, dazed, in shock, unable to process the scale of what had just happened. Parents searched frantically for children, neighbors called out for neighbors, and the tornadoes kept coming. As the sun set on April 27, casting an eerie orange glow over the devastation, yet another round of supercells pushed into northern Alabama and southern Tennessee. These storms produced more tornadoes, including several strong EF3s and EF4s, adding to the already staggering death toll and destruction. By nightfall, the Storm Prediction Center had logged over 100 tornado reports for the day, and that number would keep climbing. Let me give you some perspective on what April 27, 2011 truly represented, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible. 224 confirmed tornadoes in a single day. That's not reports, that's confirmed tornadoes, each one surveyed and documented by the National Weather Service. 15 tornadoes rated EF4 or higher. 15 violent tornadoes, the kind that occur maybe once or twice in a typical year across the entire country. On April 27, there were 15 in one day, 4 EF5 tornadoes, 4 in one afternoon. To put that in perspective again, the entire decade of the 2000s, from 2000 to 2009, had only 8 EF5s total. April 27 had half that number in a matter of hours. The death toll, 316 people across 6 states. 316 families destroyed, futures erased, dreams ended. Alabama alone lost 238 residents. The state's deadliest tornado day since the 1932 outbreak, nearly 80 years prior. And the injuries. Thousands upon thousands of people were injured. Some critically, with traumatic injuries that would require months or years of recovery. Others with psychological trauma that would never fully heal. The sound of sirens or dark clouds triggering panic attacks. The memory of that day forever burned into their minds. The economic damage exceeded $10.2 billion. That's billion with a B. Homes, businesses, infrastructure, entire communities destroyed. Insurance companies were overwhelmed. FEMA resources were stretched to the breaking point. But you know what? Numbers, as staggering as they are, don't tell the full story. They can't. Because behind every statistic is a human being, a person with a name, a family, a story. Let me tell you about some of them. There was a young mother in Tuscaloosa who threw herself over her infant daughter as their home collapsed around them. The walls caved in, the roof was ripped away, debris rained down, but she held on. She held on. When first responders found them hours later, the mother had severe injuries, broken bones, lacerations. But the baby was alive, barely a scratch on her. That mother's body had been her child's shelter. There was an elderly couple in Phil Campbell, married for over 50 years, who rode out the tornado in their basement. Their home was completely destroyed, reduced to a foundation and scattered debris. When they emerged from the basement, everything they owned was gone. Their photo albums, their wedding pictures, their memories, scattered across the county. But they were alive, and they held each other in the rubble and cried tears of relief and grief all at once. There was a high school in Hackleberg where a janitor, a man who'd worked there for 30 years, heard the warnings and opened the school building to neighbors who needed shelter. Dozens of people took refuge in the school's interior hallways. When the tornado hit, it destroyed parts of the building, but those interior hallways held. That janitor's quick thinking saved lives. There were first responders who worked for days without sleep, pulling people from rubble, treating injuries, searching for survivors. Firefighters, police officers, paramedics, ordinary citizens who grabbed flashlights and work gloves and dug through debris with their bare hands because someone might be trapped underneath, and every second mattered. There were volunteer groups that descended on Alabama from across the country, bringing supplies, labor, hope, church groups, disaster relief organizations, just random people who saw the devastation on the news and thought, I have to help. They cooked meals, cleared debris, rebuilt homes, held crying strangers who had lost everything. That's the story of April 27, not just the destruction, but the response, the resilience, the refusal to give up. In the days immediately following the outbreak, the scale of the disaster became clearer. Aerial surveys revealed the true extent of the damage, track after track after track, visible from the air as stripped forest and cleared land. Some tornado paths were so wide and so long that they looked like massive scars carved into the earth. President Barack Obama declared a major disaster for Alabama, and FEMA teams deployed to the region. The National Guard was activated, setting up shelters, distributing food and water, helping with search and rescue operations. The Red Cross opened dozens of shelters across the affected states, but even with all that help, the need was overwhelming. Entire communities had been destroyed. People had lost not just their homes, but everything. Their cars, their clothes, their medications, their identification documents, their jobs in some cases because the businesses they worked for were gone. Power restoration took weeks in some areas. Crews from utility companies across the country came to help. But the damage to the electrical infrastructure was so extensive that it took time, massive amounts of time and labor, to rebuild. And then there were the bodies, the grim task of searching through rubble, identifying victims, notifying families. Some people were never found, their remains scattered or buried so deeply that recovery was impossible. Families held funerals for empty caskets, or for partial remains, or waited months for closure that might never come. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors dealt with PTSD, depression, anxiety. Children who'd lived through the tornadoes developed phobias, night terrors. Adults struggled with survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived when their neighbors didn't. Communities that had been tight-knit were scattered as people moved away, unable to rebuild or too traumatized to stay. But slowly, something began to happen. Communities started to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. Neighbors who'd lost everything helped other neighbors who'd lost everything. Strangers became friends, bonded by shared trauma and shared determination. In Tuscaloosa, the University of Alabama became a hub for recovery efforts. Students, faculty, and staff volunteered by the thousands, clearing debris, organizing supply drives, tutoring kids whose schools had been destroyed. The university's football stadium became a distribution center for relief supplies. In Phil Campbell, residents marked the one-year anniversary of the tornado by planting trees, hundreds of them, replacing some of what had been lost. They held memorials for the dead, celebrations for the survivors, and vowed to rebuild stronger. In Hackleberg, a town that had been nearly erased, leaders implemented some of the strictest building codes in the state, requiring new structures to have reinforced safe rooms. They weren't going to let another tornado catch them unprepared. And across Alabama and the affected states, there was a renewed focus on tornado preparedness, on having multiple ways to receive warnings, on building community shelters, on education. Schools started doing more frequent tornado drills. Towns installed better siren systems. Weather services improved their warning capabilities. But, let me be clear, rebuilding took years. Some areas still bear the scars today, over a decade later. Some families never fully recovered, emotionally or financially. Some people moved away and never came back. The 2011 Super Outbreak changed the South in ways both visible and invisible, leaving a mark that won't fade for generations. Now, let's talk about the meteorological lessons, because April 27 forced the weather community to rethink a lot of assumptions. First, forecasters realized that even with good warnings, even with high-risk outlooks days in advance, even with tornado emergencies and sirens blaring, people still died. Why? Because warnings are only effective if people can receive them, understand them, and act on them. The morning storms that knocked out power eliminated one of the primary warning methods for thousands of people. That was a critical failure point. After 2011, there was a huge push for redundancy in warning systems. Weather radios with battery backup, smartphone apps, community sirens, door-to-door warnings in some cases. Second, The outbreak highlighted the danger of long track, violent tornadoes crossing multiple communities. When you have a tornado on the ground for 80 or 90 miles, that's not just one town in danger, that's dozens of communities. Warning coordination became crucial, and the National Weather Service improved their protocols for tracking and communicating these long-duration events. Third, the sheer number of simultaneous tornadoes overwhelmed traditional warning systems. When you have multiple tornado warnings in effect at the same time, all in the same viewing area, how do you communicate that to the public without causing confusion or desensitization? The weather community is still working on this problem, developing things like impact-based warnings that emphasize the threat level rather than just saying tornado warning. Fourth, the outbreak exposed vulnerabilities in building construction. Mobile homes, as tragic as it is to say, are death traps in violent tornadoes. They offer essentially no protection against EF4 or EF5 winds. After 2011, there was increased advocacy for community safe rooms, especially in mobile home parks and low-income areas where people might not have access to sturdy shelter. And finally, April 27 was a wake-up call about climate and tornado outbreaks. Now, I want to be clear. You cannot say that climate change caused the 2011 super outbreak. Individual events don't work that way, but what scientists are studying is whether the atmospheric conditions that create these kinds of setups, the extreme moisture, the powerful jet streams, the instability, are becoming more frequent or more intense as the climate warms. That research is ongoing and it's complicated, but it's critically important for understanding future risk. Let's compare April 27, 2011 to the previous benchmark, the 1974 super outbreak, because the comparison is striking. April 3rd and 4th, 1974 produced 148 confirmed tornadoes over 2 days across 13 states. 30 of those were F4 or F5 on the old Fujita scale. 330 people died. It was, at the time, the worst tornado outbreak in U.S. history, and it remained so for 37 years. April 25 through 28, 2011 produced 368 confirmed tornadoes over 4 days across 21 states. April 27 alone had 224 tornadoes, more than the entire 1974 outbreak. 15 tornadoes were EF4 or EF5. 324 people died in the overall outbreak, with 316 on April 27 alone. By every metric, the 2011 super outbreak was larger. More tornadoes, wider geographic area, comparable death toll despite vastly improved forecasting and warning systems. Think about that for a second. In 1974, tornado forecasting was in its infancy. Doppler radar was experimental. There was no storm prediction center as we know it today, no high-resolution computer models, no smartphones with instant alerts. And yet, despite all our technological advances, despite days of warning, despite meteorologists begging people to take shelter, we still lost over 300 lives in 2011. Why? Because nature, when it decides to unleash its full fury, is simply overwhelming. An EF5 tornado doesn't care about your warnings, your shelters, your preparations. It destroys everything in its path. And when you have 4 of them in one day, along with dozens of other violent tornadoes, the result is catastrophic no matter how prepared you are. So, what is the legacy of April 27, 2011? What did we learn? What changed? On a practical level, a lot changed. Warning systems improved, building codes were strengthened in many areas, community shelters were built, education programs expanded, weather services invested in better radar technology, better communication systems, better training. On a cultural level, the outbreak deepened the South's already strong awareness of tornado danger. People in Tornado Alley, the Great Plains, have always lived with tornadoes as a fact of life. But April 27 reminded everyone that Dixie Alley, the southeastern U.S., is just as vulnerable, maybe more so because of the terrain, the population density, the prevalence of mobile homes, and the fact that tornadoes often occur at night or in rain-wrapped conditions where they're harder to see. Communities that were hit have annual memorial services now, remembering those who were lost, celebrating those who survived, honoring those who helped. In Tuscaloosa, there's a memorial park dedicated to the victims of the April 27 tornado. In Hackleberg-Phil Campbell, monuments stand as reminders of what was lost and what was overcome. And on a personal level, for the hundreds of thousands of people who lived through that day, April 27 is a dividing line in their lives. There's before the tornado and there's after. Their stories, their memories, their scars, they carry them forever. But here's the question we have to ask, the uncomfortable question that doesn't have an easy answer. Could it happen again? The honest answer is yes, absolutely yes. The meteorological conditions that created the 2011 Super Outbreak, extreme moisture, powerful jet stream, massive instability, wind shear, those conditions can and will occur again. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but eventually the atmosphere will align in that same deadly way. We can't prevent tornadoes. We can't stop supercells from forming or funnel clouds from touching down. Nature is going to do what nature does. What we can control is our response. We can make sure people have access to warnings through multiple channels. We can build stronger structures with reinforced safe rooms. We can educate communities about what to do when a tornado warning is issued. We can have emergency plans, supply kits, designated shelter areas. We can learn from April 27, honor the memories of those who died by doing better, by being more prepared, by taking the threat seriously. Because the worst tornado day in U.S., history taught us one undeniable truth. Tornadoes are not just statistics or radar images or news footage. They are real, they are deadly, and they don't discriminate. They can strike rich neighborhoods or poor, cities or rural areas, young or old. And when they do, the only things that matter are preparation, awareness, and the willingness to help each other survive. April 27, 2011. 224 tornadoes, 4 EF5s, 316 lives lost, billions of dollars in damage, entire communities destroyed, but also thousands of lives saved because people took shelter, neighbors helping neighbors, first responders risking their lives to pull survivors from rubble, volunteers traveling hundreds of miles to help strangers, communities rebuilding, stronger and more resilient than before. On that day, the sky became a weapon, nature's fury unleashed in its most violent form, winds that exceeded 200 miles per hour, tornadoes that stayed on the ground for nearly 100 miles, destruction that could be seen from space. But the human spirit responded, with courage, with compassion, with an unwillingness to let tragedy have the final word. The 2011 Super Outbreak stands as both a warning and a testament. A warning that nature's power is absolute, that we must respect it, prepare for it, never underestimate it. And a testament to human resilience, to our capacity to endure the unendurable, to rebuild what was destroyed, to find hope in the midst of devastation. April 27 will never be forgotten by those who lived through it. The scars, both physical and emotional, remain. But so does the strength, the determination, the reminder that even when the sky turns dark and the winds begin to roar, we survive. We remember those we lost. We honor their memory by learning, by preparing, by caring for our communities and each other. Because that's what April 27 taught us in the end. Not just about tornadoes, but about ourselves. About what we're capable of when faced with nature's worst. About the bonds that hold us together when everything else is torn apart. The worst tornado day in U.S. history was also a day when humanity showed its best. And that is the legacy that endures, long after the debris is cleared and the scars begin to fade. The sky broke loose on April 27, 2011. But so did the strength of the human spirit. And in the end, that's what survived.